interruptions, please mute during the presentation. We welcome questions through the chat feature. Send them to me, Lily Filler, and I will be compiling them and presenting them during at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the program over to the Honorable Richard Gergel, who will introduce the guests for the program. Richard, take it away.
Well, thank you. And we have all are stumbling through the efforts of our mastery of this new technology, and I apologize for folks for for the delays in which we have had in starting this program. The whole idea of this program has been to gather as an organization when we're not able to physically gather, and to discuss and kibitz about our love of Jewish culture and Jewish history. My partner in this endeavor is Robert Rosen, who has authored numerous books on Jewish history and South Carolina history, including Confederate Jews, Roosevelt and the Holocaust, and A Short History of Charleston. I've also done my share of history writing on Jewish and civil rights history, including the history of the early Columbia Jews with my dear wife, Melinda, and Unexampled Courage, the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard, and the awakening of President Harry Truman and Judge J. Wade's Waring. Robert and I have day jobs. Robert is one of the state's premier family law attorneys, and I am a United States District Judge. Our topic today lies at really the center of the study which we have done over the 27 years of this organization, looking at the early history of Jews in South Carolina and the remarkable of Jews in small towns across the state. Joining us today are Dr. Gary Zola, the Director of Jewish Archives at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and author of the outstanding book, Isaac Harvey of Charleston, Jewish Reformer and Intellectual. As many of our members know, Reformed Judaism in America was born in Charleston at Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim Synagogue, and guided by the brilliant visionary Isaac Harvey. No one has greater knowledge on the history of KKPE and its prominence in the development of American Judaism than Dr. Zola. Welcome, Dr. Zola. Now, next we have Dr. Sam Gruber, an internationally renowned expert on Jewish architecture and preservation of Jewish historic sites. His early scholarship focused on lost and disappearing Jewish Americans, historic Jewish sites in Europe, and in recent years he has focused on the Jewish sites in America.
That's a password.
He is the author of American Synagogues, A Century of Architecture in Jewish Community. Dr. Gruber teaches art history and Jewish studies in Syracuse. Welcome, Dr. Gruber. And of course, our executive director, Rachel Barnett, who's staffing the controls here and dealing with all the trauma, as well as sharing with us her personal story of growing up in small town South Carolina in Somerton and attending Temple Sinai Synagogue in Sumter, and she'll provide us some real life experience of the importance of these small town synagogues in maintaining Jewish identity. Now, many years ago, Robert and I had a talk at the Gibbs Museum upon the opening of the wonderful exhibit Dale Rosengarten did on the Jews of South Carolina, in which we discussed city Jews and country Jews. Now, understanding what we're talking about, Charlestonians viewed anybody who was more than 1 foot outside of Charleston as a country Jew. That was not a compliment. And Robert and I would debate at that time and other times the remarkable contribution of these country Jews. They include a Nobel laureate, Joseph Goldstein of King Street, financial gurus Bernard Baruch of Camden and Ben Bernanke of Dillon, legendary movie director Stanley Donen of Columbia, Speaker of the House for over 50 years Solomon Blunt of Barnwell, and many more. Our discussion today will continue that talk we did many years ago development first of early American Jewry in Charleston, its expansion across South Carolina in the late 19th and early 20th century with active Jewish communities across the state. Before we engage our guests, I thought it might be important for Robert to provide us some historic context for Jewish immigration, which occurred from the beginning of the colony in the late 1600s into the present. Robert?
It's great to be with y'all. You know what? We all know that in general, the Jewish immigration to America begins with the Sephardic Jews in the 1600s. And, you know, remember the Jews are run out of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And these are known as the Sephardic Jews for Sephardic, because, you know, they're from the Iberian Peninsula. But they go to England and they go to the Netherlands. So by the time the Americas are settled, you find these Sephardic Jews in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Brazil, and finally in South Carolina. I mean, the first Jews in America come from Brazil to New York. These are Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking Jews. They're Orthodox. A lot of people seem to think that somehow because KKBE was later reformed, that these Sephardic Jews were reformed. Well, no, they were Orthodox, and they come to Charleston, and most of the Jews in Charleston in the from the late 1600s into the 1700s are Sephardic, meaning Spanish and Portuguese. And they have names like Da Costa, Tobias, Mendez, de Oliveira, Salvador, by way of the Netherlands and London. They create a synagogue in which the service, and Gary Zola will correct me on this, is either in Spanish and Portuguese or in Portuguese and in English. And so they're a very distinctive group. And if you think about the American Revolution, these are mostly Sephardic Jews who fight in the American Revolution. But as time goes on, there's a great immigration from Germany and from the German states. I mean, 1.5 million people come to America from Germany, of whom 100,000 were German Jews. And the Germans take over at Beth Elohim and the German synagogue. So these are now different names that we hear in Charleston and in other places. The Germans take over KKBE, and at some point, one of the most famous rabbis, Gustavus Poznański, who I think is Polish and Russian and German, the congregations shift. For example, 1826 to 1850, 33% of the Jews who came to Charleston were German, 23 were Polish, and 18 were from England. So now we have the German period. So when you think about the Civil War, the names that you hear are German names. It's the same congregations, but now they're from Germany. Later, of course, they're the ancestors. You know, I can say my ancestors, and probably the ancestors of most of us. The Tsar decided he was going to attack the Jews and increase these pogroms from the 1880s to the 1920s. And most of the Jews in America today, these are our ancestors. Well, of course, when they arrived in Charleston, what did they find? There was an Orthodox synagogue. There was an Orthodox synagogue before the Civil War, Bris Shalom, and it had 40 to 50 members, but after the Civil War, when this new wave of immigration came in, you had Russian speakers, Yiddish speakers, and people from Poland and from Russia. The same thing is true in Colombia. The original synagogue, Shereth Israel, is formed before the Civil War, but in 1896, Tree of Life, you've got a German Jew, August Kohn, you've got immigrants from Russia and Poland who then begin to develop that synagogue. By the early part of the 20th century, the great majority of Jews in South Carolina are these Russian immigrants. And one thing I find very humorous is that Rabbi Barnett Elzis, who wrote a history of the Jews in South Carolina from a very elitist point of view, he said writing of KKB, he said in a footnote, there is a Polish congregation in Charleston, but it has no history worth repeating. So as we know, the earlier Jews sort of looked down on the new immigrants. In any event, the new immigrants created new synagogues. Bristol on Beth Israel is created, 1911. And then the later immigrants then create conservative Judaism. And most of the synagogues in South Carolina that are developed are created by these new Ashkenazi immigrants. So with that, I will turn it back over to Richard.
Very, very good. That's great.
Thank you.
Dr. Zola, many people are surprised to learn there are actually Jews in South Carolina, or the large Jewish presence in Charleston in the early part of colonial America. Talk to us a little bit about how that happened to occur and why Charleston became such a significant center of Jewish life.
Well, I'm going to do that, but you know, since even though I have my PhD, I'm also an ordained rabbi, you know that before I speak, I have something to say. So what I have to say is, first of all, I'm very delighted to be here with all of you. As I'm looking over the checkerboard square, I see quite a number of people I know, friends, and you're just going to have to take my greetings privately. But I do also see, at least I've spotted at least 4 rabbis who are joining us today, and they're my colleagues, so I have to acknowledge them. I saw Rabbi Stephanie Alexander is on this call, and she, of course, is the rabbi of KKBE. And Rabbi Harry Danziger, the former president of the CCAR, is on this call. And Rabbi Charles Sherman is also on this call. And the dean of the Cincinnati campus, the historic Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College, is also on this call. So I gather also sitting together with us is a fifth I see is Stephanie's better half, Rabbi Aaron Sherman, Rabbi Charles Sherman, and Nancy's son. So anyway, welcome to all my colleagues. If I've missed any of you, you'll forgive me, I hope. So I'm going to answer that question, and then I'm going to, if I may, Rachel, I'm going to share my screen. And for those of you who are not familiar with screen sharing, I'm going to put something up, and there's going to be a horizontal bar that you'll see between what I show you and also everybody else who is here that you're looking at, and you can slide that horizontal bar to the left or the right so you can see either more of what I'm showing you or less of what I'm showing you. So very quickly, I get a lot of pleasure. One of the highlights of my professional career is to tell my audiences that in the early 19th century, Charleston, South Carolina had the largest Jewish community of any community in the United States of America. And yes, I do mean larger than New York City. Now, of course, I often take brickbats when I say that in front of a New York audience because they are genetically wired to believe that that's impossible, but it is true. And one of the reasons is, and we're going to get to see this in just a minute, is that Charleston, along with all of the colonial centers during the colonial period, were all port cities. And for a short period of time, sort of like Camelot, just a few years, maybe 15 years, Charleston had a lot of advantages, and because of business and commerce, and for those reasons, the population grew. And at one time, there were nearly 800 Jews in early 19th century in Charleston, and that would be a big community for even today. So with that said, and I'm going to try to do this in about 6-7 minutes, so those of you who are worried about all the speakers, I don't want you to get too nervous. I'm going to share my screen now, and you should be seeing right now a sketching of the historic Cincinnati campus. And it should say in front of you, everybody, that the early history of KKBE, Charleston, South Carolina. Rachel, is that what you're seeing?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to move ahead now. We're talking about the early history. This is a black and white photo of famous KKBE, even as it looks today, but we do have an early history. Before I get to that, I just want to point out, of course, that there were Jews in Charleston very early on. If we take a look at the fact that Charleston becomes, if you will, a chartered colony in 1669, we know that there was a Jew who interpreted for the governor. He was there in 1669. So only a few years later, we have documentary evidence of if I said 1669, I meant 1695 is when that Jewish interpreter was there working for Archdale. And we always, in American Jewish history, we distinguish between when Jews are there individually and when it is that they begin to organize into a congregation. And that began to happen in Charleston in about the early 1700s. As Robert Rosen pointed out, we start to have not only the few Sephardim who join in, but we also have some Ashkenazim who start to come at the early part of the 18th century. And we know that these individual Jews begin to band together and they begin to worship informally, probably in little homes, not in the public square, starting in the early years of the 18th century. However, we know for a fact that there are enough Jews in Charleston to be able to organize a congregation, and they do that in the year 1749. It's one of the original colonial congregations. And that congregation begins to meet in a small wooden house, which is located on Union Street, not too far from what Queen Street would be today, for those of you who know Charleston. They met in a rented facility, and they moved a number of times. Of course, the prime mover of this early congregation was a Jew by the name of Moses Cohen. It's a good name for a Jewish president or a Jewish leader of a congregation. And he happens to be the oldest identifiable grave. He has the oldest identifiable grave in the famous Cumming Street Cemetery that belongs to the congregation. Another prominent name, Tobias, was also helped out Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen was sort of the religious leader. Now, in the subsequent years, the congregation moved from one rental facility to the other. And I do want to point out that we believe, and this work was done by the great local Charleston historian by the name of Solomon Breitbart, who pointed out that there was clearly a breakup in the congregation before its famous building began to go up. Probably around the Revolutionary time, it looks like the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim had a fight, and they split into two congregations. But eventually, they were able to resolve that fight, and I'm going to show you how we know that happened in just a minute, thanks to Solomon Breitbart. And they eventually reunite, and they locate some property on what today is Hazel Street, and they decide they're going to build a congregation, and they do build a congregation, a beautiful building, which goes up in the, they dedicated it in 1792, and it is ready for action starting in 1794. That, friends, is during President Washington's administration. Now, that famous wrought iron fence that we're all familiar with, that didn't go up initially. There was sort of a wooden fence that originally, we know that from this very early sketching that you have. I also want to call your attention to the shutters that are on, you clearly can see shutters, and we know for a fact from newspaper articles that some mean-spirited Charlestonians threw stones at the windows of the synagogue, tried to break the synagogue. So you see, there were anti-Semites even back in the colonial period. But more or less, life in Charleston was very good for the Jews. And when this congregation was dedicated, none other than the governor of the state, Moultrie, was present, along with a lot of dignitaries. And in addition to that, we have this man on the right to thank for the drawings we have of that first building, which went up in 1794 and was the home of KKBE. The handsome man on the right is a man by the name of, somebody's got their mic on, they're gonna have to turn it off, is a man by the name of Solomon Carvalho. And Carvalho is the son of one of the founders of the Reformed Society of Israelites. I'm coming to that immediately. And Carvalho was an artist, and here he's pictured with John Fremont, the first man to run for president on the Republican ticket. He was also an explorer, and Solomon Carvalho, the photographer and the artist, he went out to explore the West. We have a book on that. So here is Carvalho's drawing of KKBE when it went up. Now, of course, it's later than that first sketching I showed you, because you can see now the wrought iron fence is up. We know that went up around 1819. That still is there to this day. And here's the interior. And what we know is that the bima, which is in the middle, if it was a Sephardic synagogue, the bima would be all the way by the doorway, with the whole distance between the ark and the bima would be empty. But you see the bima's in the middle, and it's been suggested that that was a compromise between the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim. It helped them to get back together when they built this building. Now, as you know, in the year 1824, there were, for a lot of reasons, there were about 50 Jews in Charleston, in this big community, who were dissatisfied with life in the synagogue. They felt that the synagogue was boring. Their children were not interested in it, the worship service. They felt that there was too much Portuguese and too much Hebrew being spoken. It made no sense. And they met in a living room, somebody's living room, in 1824, and they made up their mind that they wanted to create what was called the Reformed Society of Israelites. And the leaders, there were 3 leaders of this rebellion. You're looking at the only sketching we have of Isaac Harvey, who was one of the most prominent leaders. And he was a newspaper editor, very prominent newspaper editor in Charleston, and he was also a teacher. This is a very rare document of Harvey's Academy from New York when he left Charleston, and he died only 6 months after leaving Charleston. The other person is this, a very poor picture, but it's all we have. This is David Nunez Carvalho, the father of Solomon, who drew the pictures. He was one of the early founders of the Reformed Society. And finally, the real leader and the memorializer, the historian of the society, young man at the time, a lawyer by the name of Abraham Moise II. And these 3 people led an effort to create what we know to be today the first organized attempt to reform Judaism in the United States. Now, very quickly, friends, and I want Rabbi Alexander to pay attention because she listens carefully to this. These 3 people and the 50 who were behind them, they approached the board of KKBE, and they made a number of suggestions for reforms. I will not go into detail, but let's just say the board declined to accept any of these ideas. And so they created their own organization. They raised money. They were going to create their own separate synagogue. And the society, as I say, was called the Reformed Society of Israelites in Charleston. At one point, we have documentary evidence that there were about 250 members of this congregation. But then, of course, towards the end of the decade, as we get towards 1828, 1829, Charleston suffered economic decline. And religion, you know, you can only become a very pious person when you have enough money to be able to live somewhere and to eat. And this became the main concern of many of the founders. Mr. Carvalho, who I showed you, who's here in this picture. Mr. Carvalho, he left Charleston. He went first to North Carolina, then eventually he would settle and spend the rest of his life in Baltimore. Became a northern, well, Baltimore is sort of a southern northern place. And then, of course, Moise remained in Charleston, but Harvey went to New York. What was it that they wanted? They wanted a more relevant and engaging worship service. They wanted a more tasteful and a refined worship service. And they wanted to enhance Jewish learning and Jewish life. Now, I have to go much more quickly. I don't have time to get into all of this because I see my time is up. But as you...
Thank you, Dr. Zoli. Other than Charleston, the only other place in South Carolina where there was a synagogue before the Civil War was in Columbia, where Shereth Israel, the congregation in Columbia, the remnant of Israel, had both a sanctuary, had a synagogue, had a Sunday school. It was the seventh Jewish Sunday school in America. It had a significant Jewish population. 2 Jews in Columbia were mayors before the Civil War. There were Jews in other small towns around, but they did not have synagogues. But the development really, after that, of synagogues is really a post-Civil War phenomenon, late 19th, early 20th century. And let me turn to my friend Dr. Gruber, and let's talk about the development of those synagogues. Dr. Gruber?
Yeah, I'm right here. We need to share the screen. Is that set up, Rachel, for me to do that?
Yeah, you're sharing from your computer.
Okay, great. Okay, hold on.
Yeah, you're viewing Sam Gruber's screen.
Yeah, sorry about that. You're going to see, let me just get this. Oops, that's the wrong one. Sorry about that. Where did it go? All right, hold 1 second. I apologize. Well, we got some great history, and I'm mostly going to show you a lot of pictures. We're going to take a quick romp through the state of South Carolina. There are a lot of communities, and we're not going to get the history of all of them, but I want to show you something about the range of the architecture and the architectural styles. Because we have Jewish settlement in, I'm getting feedback here. Are you getting that? Because we're getting, got my speaker off. Because we have Jewish settlement in South Carolina for over 200 years, we can trace pretty much the entire trajectory of Jewish identity as it's expressed in architecture. Jewish identity, the way Jews wanted to see themselves, that is how the insides of synagogues were created, but also how they wanted to project their image to the non-Jewish majority, how they wanted to be seen within their communities as Americans, as American citizens, and as believers in God, part of a community of worshipers that included Jews and many denominations of Christians. So we will run very quickly. We've already seen in Gary's excellent presentation something of the early history of KKBE. And in the design of KKBE, we see the Sephardi arrangement, which he already discussed, which is that longitudinal design, but where the congregants face each other across a large empty space. And he mentioned that there was probably a compromise early on, which allowed both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi arrangements of synagogue interiors to be represented. So the bima, or the teva, as was known in the Sephardi tradition, was pushed a little bit toward the center. We can see that same kind of compromise made in Venice too in the 18th century. So it's something that is not uncommon when diverse communities come together. It says that you're supposed to really practice the minchag of the community in which you're residing, but when you have two competing minchas, you really have to come to some agreement. Now, after a short time, what would happen, as Dr. Zola already indicated, you would also have splits in the congregations. So first there was the abortive effort to start a Reform congregation in the 1820s, but by the mid-century, when a new synagogue was built in a Greek revival style, we already had Reform elements dominating, and then very shortly we have a series of Orthodox congregations being created. In the way of Judaism, each congregation tends to spin off a daughter congregation or a rival congregation. We all know, or many Jews know, the joke where you have one synagogue that you attend and the other you would not be caught dead in. And what we often have are competing congregations. Although in small congregations, very quickly we find that competition actually combines into cooperation, because both congregations, or sometimes three congregations in the case of Charleston, where eventually we would have we'd have Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, they have to band together as Jews in the face of a much larger Christian majority. So this is a Greek temple design, and it's not unique to synagogues at the time, because the Greek revival was the favored form for the architecture of the new republic. It recalled the democracy of Athens, if you will. And this is a kind of compromise structure. On the outside, it looks Greek, but on the inside, there's actually a flat dome, which recalls a more Roman design. And it was much more practical and embracing for the congregation. And here you can see a picture as it's arranged today. Remarkable in the synagogue today are the stained glass windows. And this is one of the earliest complete sets of synagogue stained glass that we have in the United States. Stained glass started to be used in synagogues around the 1840s and 50s in small designs, but in Savannah around 1876, we get 3 stained glass windows over the Aron HaKodesh. And then Charleston, after an earthquake in the 1880s, puts in all new windows, and that's what we're seeing here. And then we begin having more and more stained glass with Jewish symbols incorporated in synagogues across the country. And today we have several more contemporary South Carolina synagogues that have some modern stained glass, which really needs to be documented much more. This PowerPoint pulls together a large number of images from a number of sources. There really is no comprehensive history of the synagogues of South Carolina. So we're hoping that this endeavor sort of kicks off a more intensive documentation project where we will collect photographs, drawings, and information on the buildings, on the people who built them, on the architects, on the artists who decorated them. So everyone who comes from a community who has this kind of information should be should be encouraged to share that material. We can see when Brit Shalom opens it gets enough funds to build its building in the 1870s, that they're also choosing a classical style. And you can see the dialogue that would exist between the now Reform Beth Elohim and the Orthodox Brit Shalom. Now there's a split from Brit Shalom, and that's Beth Israel. They just take an old house and they convert it into a synagogue. This is a picture of the building when it's no longer a synagogue, but you can see it's just a simple wood frame building. That type of progression from renting a space to buying a simple house, converting it to a synagogue, and then finally when you get enough money, if your congregation has survived, to build something more substantial. That's a progression that we see in almost every city across America. Now, Brit Shalom, by the late 1920s, is substantial enough that they can build this large brick structure, and it recalls urban Orthodox synagogues in cities across the country. It faces the street. It's very impressive. It's announcing, "We are here." It has 2 levels, probably classrooms and social halls in the basement. and then a main sanctuary. And then the towers, these vestigial towers on the side would house stairwells, which would take you up to a women's gallery up above. And we can see that gallery here, and we can see a bit of the ark. The ark actually, and the benches, some of these materials were actually donated by Beth Elohim. And then later on, when Beth Shalom merged in the 1950s with Beth Israel, they also took some of those to the Beth Israel synagogue, and we can see them today. So Beth Israel, which you see on the right, started as a modest congregation in and then built a more substantial building in 1948. And then you can see how it corresponds to the rival Orthodox congregation of Brit Shalom. But when they combined, they both moved to this newer building in 1955, and that's where they are today. And you can note the beautiful gates, again, continuing that Charleston tradition. But you can see Beth Israel, originally they had a more Eastern European look with a Aron HaKodesh with two carved wooden lions supporting a Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, which we find in Orthodox shuls in Europe and in cities across America. But when they combined their congregations, Brit Shalom brought their more classical ark, the one that is much more corresponding to Beth Elohim, to the new building, and that's what is there today. Now, in 1955, when they split, when they joined, rather, another split happened, though. A large number of people broke off from the Orthodox congregations to form Charleston's conservative congregation. And this is Synagogue Emmanuel, and you can see the style of architecture is radically different. So this was built in 1955. It was in use for about 10 years, and it is represents a break. The conservative movement very much embraced modern life, but maintained traditional Orthodox halakha. So they were bridging Orthodoxy and then bringing it to a more modern America. It is a really a remarkable statement in Charleston at the time, and it's an early, very early example of an austere modernism in the South. And
how do you explain?
The building, which was built after the war, has
Rachel, can you unmute me?
Art Nouveau, a stripped down classicism, and the three arches recalled the old three arches of the 1920s building, but the 1955 conservative building is radically different in every way. And then more recently, Synagogue Emmanuel has built a new building designed by the Atlanta-based Jewish architect Benjamin Hirsch, and this was dedicated in 1979. And then new additions and extensions have been made to this in more recent times, and it is still a very large and vibrant community. And here are some interior pictures, and you can see some of the unusual features, particularly that stone framing around the Aron HaKodesh. Now, there were other simple synagogues built around the country and around the state, sorry, and throughout the 20th century. We'll see Columbia and we'll see Greenville, but also it's worth noting the little synagogue in Beaufort, which is very much in a rural architectural style, and it recalls a kind of simple wooden, you might even say a shtetl ideal, but it's also similar to small church-like synagogues that are erected in towns across the country. You can see it has the wooden, the carved wooden Decalogue between the two lions. And here's just a comparison. We see it here in the upper left. And these are 5 other synagogues of about the same time, all around the turn of the 20th century, from Texas, from Vermont, from Tennessee, from Pennsylvania. And you can see that small congregations were all sort of adopting this very simple type of construction. Local contractors would build the building, and it would fit in very nicely with the church environment of these small towns. In Sumter, we have an exceptional building today. It replaced a large wood frame building with a tower, probably built in the 1890s, probably designed by one of the earliest Jewish architects in the South, Alfred Eichberg. We don't know much about it except for this one picture, but today we still have Temple Sinai that we're going to hear more about shortly, and it's a somewhat Moorish style, meaning that it has these horseshoe arches over the windows, and it's most remarkable for its stained glass. And you can visit this today because the Sumter County Museum is now administering the synagogue, although it still functions for worship when there is a congregation. And the remarkable stained glass windows from about 1912 that we're still learning more about are exceptionally well preserved. And there's also a wonderful new museum, the Temple Sinai History Center, about the history of Jews in the region and about the Holocaust. And like many sites across South Carolina, and I'm very impressed by this, there's a very informative historical marker in front of this is Columbia, but we find one in Sumter, and we find them in many of the other towns across the state, telling a lot about the Jewish history of the community and of the town. In Columbia, the first Orthodox congregation was House of Peace. This then rebuilt a new building. It transitioned to conservative by the 1930s, and it's a big mix of a kind of a Byzantine and classical style, very popular across America in cities. It's a much more, the massing is much more centralized, and inside it brings a lot of the congregants much closer to the bema. We also have the beginnings of the Tree of Life Synagogue, a Reform congregation already in 1905 with a building that we don't know too much about, but we have this tantalizing photo, and you can see the stained glass in the windows. Tree of Life built a very striking modern building in 1952 by a leading Jewish architect in South Carolina, Louis Wolfe, and you can see it today as a Unitarian church. And then both Beth Shalom has built in a modern style. This is their third building on Trenholm Road, built in the 1970s. And here's the interior of Tree of Life and their new building, also on Trenholm Road, built, I forgot the date, I don't have it on here, but about the same time.
I think she's
There you see
controlling
the
you.
interior.
Yeah.
One of the styles that became very popular, and we see it across the South particularly, and I think it ties into sort of the antebellum architecture of South Carolina and other states, is a love of classicism. So, you know, there's the Thomas Jefferson legacy in the South from Monticello and the University of Virginia, but it trickles down. And then of course we have the Greek style from KKBE. And if we look at the first building of Beth Israel in Greenville, we see what looks like a school or a bank, but it was indicative of what a style that was popular for synagogues. Originally, the classical style appealed to the Reform movement, but by the 1920s and 30s, it was adopted by the Orthodox. This building was closed, it became a church, then became private property, and in the last few years, it's been restored as a private residence, and you can see it's quite a luxurious property with a swimming pool and attached gardens. Very striking is the second building of Beth Israel, built in 1958, which is a very handsome modern building. And you can see how it announces its presence by that large decalogue, the large tablets of the law on the facade facing the street. And we can guess that it's a conservative congregation and not a Reform one, because the words of the Ten Commandments, the first words are in Hebrew, not in English, or using Roman numerals. And inside there's beautiful stained glass. We don't know who did the stained glass in the 1950s, but I'm hoping that we'll learn this soon. Then we have a whole series of buildings built in small towns around the country, around the state. And I'm not going to go into the detail of them because I don't know them, but I've collected images, and most of them are designed between World War I and the late 1920s. And you can see they all follow more or less a form. This is Temple of Israel in Greenville. and it's new, the new congregation, which recalls some of the form of the older one. Sorry, here's another classical building in Spartanburg,
This is
and
magic.
this is the new modern version of the Spartanburg.
I can't get
Here's out of Yeshurun, a little classical temple from Aiken. Here's Camden, a little more unusual. It was a Catholic chapel and then it became a synagogue. Dillon, South Carolina. Here we have Anderson, Georgetown from 1949, Kingtree from 1945, and Waterboro from 1951. So even after the war, in the small towns, this earlier sort of church-like style continued, and only a few of the bigger centers experimented with modernism. This is Orangeburg, and here we're moving now into the 1970s in Florence, and finally some newer synagogues in Myrtle Beach, where there are new settlements. Neither of these buildings are particularly inspiring as architecture, and they show that the buildings kind of become billboards. It's the Decalogue and the big menorah, which are all that's needed to identify them. You take away those symbols and they could be almost any roadside architecture today. Okay, so that was a lot of buildings in a short time, and I hope we still have a little bit of time left to for some
I'm
comments.
hoping.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Gruber. Rachel, have you unmuted Robert and me?
Yeah, y'all are unmuted.
Thank you. Dr. Gruber, thank you very much. I know we're running a few minutes late, but we started late. So, Rachel, could you talk a little bit of, you showed the beautiful synagogue in Sumter. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like and how important these little synagogues were to the Jewish families in these small towns?
Sure, absolutely. These synagogues were everything to Jewish families. I grew up 23 miles away from Sumter in a little town called Somerton. We were the only Jewish family there, but we had 4 kids. And we would go drive 23 miles every weekend to go for Sunday school, religious school, and for Friday night services. Sumter, of course, being very reformed. It pulled at that time, this is the 60s and early 70s when I was a kid, but we were pulling from Camden, Bishopville, Manning, the whole area. So Sumter was like the hub for all of these small communities. Everybody's family were merchants. Everybody had stores. So we would drive to Sumter and we were part of the community. As a matter of fact, my father grew up also in the Sumter Synagogue. And I have a letter that his mother wrote him when he was at Carolina in the late 40s, talking about coming home for the Seder supper. We're going to Sumter to the temple. And it's an absolute treasure that I have. My mother taught Sunday school. We were all there. My dad would sit in the car with a newspaper waiting on us. He served on the temple board. You know, life revolved around, there was sisterhood. It was everything and it didn't matter. I guess in this day and age, 23 miles doesn't seem like a lot, but it was a different community to go over. I was confirmed with a group there, and I have the confirmation picture is now hanging up in the Sumter, in our new Jewish History Museum, which was the social hall. And one thing that Sumter did, they knew that they saw the handwriting on the wall and they planned in advance. There is a wonderful, if people can get to Sumter when it reopens, they did a first-class job on a small museum there. It starts with what is a Jew? It talks about holidays. It moves around and talks about South Carolina Jews in South Carolina. It talks about Sumter County. And then there's also a whole beautiful section, well done, on the Holocaust, and Abe Sturm, the family, he was a Holocaust survivor who lived in Sumter. They pull from all of the school districts, which, you know, think about it in a small town like that, but they have had lots and lots of visitors. It's been very important, and it's important to the community at large. And Sumter County Museum has done a really nice job They have really knowledgeable docents, and they also do programming. So you might want to check out their website if you go to Sumter County Museum. You know,
Richard,
Yes,
Richard, wanted to ask Dr. Gruber a quick question.
go right ahead.
Dr. Gruber, I know we're running a little short of time, but I grew up at Emmanuel Synagogue in the 50s, and it was very interesting. Your point was that all of these synagogues look very classical and historic, and all of a sudden the Jews start building these super modern buildings. I mean, I thought Emmanuel was very futuristic for the 50s. Why did the Jews do that? Why didn't they build more traditional buildings?
Well, you could see in the small towns, some of them were still building traditionally, but where congregations were more exposed to general trends, they looked not just nationally, but internationally at where architecture was going. And a lot of architects, especially Jewish architects, were engaged in this post-war modernist movement. Percival Goodman, Eric Mendelsohn, and others were leaders of this, and they were Jews. Jews actually helped introduce modernism in Europe in between the war, but because of the Holocaust, there was so much destruction of communities, there was very little building in Europe after the war, but the tradition came to America with refugees and caught on here. But Judaism was the first religion to embrace modernism. It had fewer ties to the past. Historicism was always, sort of problematic because it tied Jews to periods that were not always happy in our long history. Modernism had none of that baggage, but also modernism appealed to orthodoxy because it was stripped down, had no decoration. It really was just a bet knesset. It was a place of gathering, or place of prayer, a bet tefillah, and that was it. And also it was very generally more affordable, using modern materials that were readily available in the post-war period. And a lot of new communities that were building in the needed to watch their budgets as they went forward. They were expanding rapidly, but they had limited resources. And I should say the reform movement, the United UHAC, had a special committee to help congregations adapt to synagogue building and use modern forms. And so did the Jewish Welfare Board, which worked with a refugee architect, Norbert Troller, who was an Auschwitz survivor, and sent out free plans and drawings of possible synagogues and Jewish community centers to small towns that couldn't afford to hire their own architects. So in this way, modernism became the norm.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting.
I'm going to ask a question that came from the audience too. I think Dr. Zola or perhaps Robert might be able to answer it. And the question was, were those early synagogues built by slaves?
Well, I'll jump in first. There's no question that the synagogues prior to the Civil War, of course, were there were indentured slaves or regular slaves, and yes, that we know that. In fact, and I know Rabbi Alexander is on the line. I think it's likely that KKB is probably the only synagogue that is still functioning as a synagogue that we know was there was slave labor that contributed to the erection of the synagogue. The only other possibility would be Turo Synagogue in Newport, and I'm not sure that we have any indication that that synagogue was significantly constructed by slave labor. I'm reading now on chat, as you are, that Rabbi Alexander is confirming this and saying that they're preparing a plaque, and that's of course there were also, yeah, go ahead, Robert, go ahead.
The synagogue had a committee that we actually studied it, and Harlan Green was on it, and I was on a number of people. And believe it or not, there are actual records of David Lopez, who was a Jewish builder, and he built the synagogue. And amazingly enough, a lot of his records are in existence. And so we know that the synagogue was built both with free labor In other words, there were builders and laborers, Irish immigrants, Germans, all kinds of people in Charleston, and slave labor. And we know that David Lopez owned slaves. So we know that KKB was built in part by slave labor and in part by free labor. And that Lopez.
Robert, isn't it also true that many of the craftsmen in Charleston were slaves?
Right. That's right.
I mean, they were the craftsmen.
Right.
And so virtually every major building, and next on Sunday, November 1, we're going to have a discussion on Charleston's early Jewish community and the city's notable history of religious tolerance. And among the folks with us will be Peter Shahid and Jonathan Green, the co-chairs of the Charleston 350 committee. And Jonathan Green, who many of you know is one of our state's most renowned artists, he has done a lot of work and study and written and painted about the talents of these slaves. And he'll basically be sharing with us that the key to Charleston, the key to the success of Charleston, was tied directly to enslaved persons.
Right.
And it's a story that needs to be shared and told and acknowledged. And you also mentioned that Jewish ownership of slaves. And Jews were by no means the center of slave trade, but they definitely owned slaves. They weren't much different from their Christian neighbors in that regard. Hopefully on November 1, we'll spend a good bit of time talking about that issue with Jonathan and with Peter Shahid.
Well, KKBE is actually acknowledging its debt to slave labor by a plaque, which is being put up by the congregation. So this is an issue which the congregation is addressing.
If I can chime in for a second, it's not just the building, it's the creation of the materials. Brick making, for instance, was primarily done by slaves. And somebody asked in chat about Mikveh Israel in Savannah. Now, the early synagogue, which was rather small, may have used slave labor. I don't know. I haven't read, but it's quite likely. The existing synagogue, which was built in the 1870s, of course, would not have used slave labor, but it's quite possible, quite likely that the brick in the building came from the brickyards that are now getting a lot of notoriety, where convict labor was being used, and the convict labor at the brickworks in Atlanta was essentially a new type of slavery. So anyone using any building in the South that was built in the 19th century probably has to deal with that legacy and should recognize it, that the building of the South and much of the building of the North, in many ways too, is dependent entirely on slave labor, or at least a slave economy.
We also know that synagogues actually often had slaves attached to the synagogue. To do what you would call custodial work, and in a certain sense that continued, in a certain form, not slavery, but African American custodial work in synagogue is really pervasive in America. The other thing I do want to point out, since the judge pointed to this, is that in the original charter of South Carolina, I mentioned that was established in 1669. There is the specific mention of that the colony would be open to, and I'm quoting, to Jews, to heathens, and to dissenters. So we should take pride that we came first in that nice listing. Jews and heathens and dissenters.
Top three, right?
Yeah,
we were the
we were there with the heathens.
Now before you laugh at that, bear in mind that there were colonies on the North American continent that didn't want Jews at all.
Right.
And so this is an explanation as to why Charleston and why South Carolina became one of those places. Jews could have gone to any port city, but the reason they go to the port cities that they did go to is because they were unmolested. They may not have had equal rights in every regard, but they were able to make a living. This is important, very important. Also, Rachel, some people were asking Judge, some people were asking what happened to the society, and I just want to quickly say that the society, as I was ending, the society sort of faded out with the economy, but the real rebirth, the switch to Reform Judaism in Charleston at KKBE begins in the fateful year of 1838. Because in 1838, as my teacher, Dr. Marcus, would say with tongue in cheek, the Lord Almighty reached down into Charleston, South Carolina in order to advance Reform Judaism, and the whole temple burned down. So the original temple, that I showed you was burned to the ground, and I know it's hard to believe, it happens to be a true fact that the Charlestonians did not have insurance. I don't understand. They must have been very assimilated, but they didn't have insurance. And we know that because they had to write to all sorts of congregations in America to raise money to create the building that now stands. They even wrote to their friends in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm proud to tell you that Cincinnati contributed to Charleston Synagogue. And then, of course, the battle then began, because in order to get that building up without insurance, not only did you have to go begging all over America, but you also had to reunite the Charleston community. And that meant you had to hold your nose. And the Republicans and the Democrats, or in this case, the reformers and the conservatives, they had to come together, and that meant compromise. And that the compromise initially was that they would bring in a religious leader who was severely, strictly Orthodox, but they would make available to the new synagogue an organ, which would not be played on the Sabbath, of course, but it would be in the building. And that's when they brought this man, Gustavus Poznansky, that Robert Rosen mentioned, was brought from New York. He had nothing but the finest Orthodox credentials. And they brought him down to Charleston. He was to lead an Orthodox congregation. But then something unbelievable happened. He met and fell in love with the richest girl in Charleston. His father-in-law was as rich as they come. And suddenly Poznansky was not so concerned about what the congregation thought of him. So he began to become a little more liberalized as he became more acculturated to Charleston's Americanized community. And he began to incline himself towards reform.
It wasn't
yeah.
It wasn't just the reform movement. The American conservative movement under Isaac Leeser was also attempting during this era to embrace a new form of American Judaism, because the orthodoxies in Europe simply didn't make sense to first and second generation Americans.
Yeah, and you're right, Judge. In the 1840s, Leeser wrote to the Charleston congregation, asked the Charleston congregation to join a union of Orthodox congregations. Charleston, in true Southern tradition, said thank you, but no thank you. The Charlestonians did not want to be a part of any national organization. But what I always say is, on the stationery of KKBE, it says proudly, on the banner on the bottom of the page, it always says, I think it still does, the birthplace of American Reform Judaism. And I always used to teach in class, well, they really should have turned that paper over and on the back put an asterisk by that and said, well, it's the birthplace of American Reform Judaism because the reformers came to the congregation and the congregation rejected their reforms, and then they had to create their own separate institution. And then the fire came and burned down their synagogue, and then they had to reunite in order to get together. And then, but eventually it did become the birthplace of Reform Judaism, but not initially.
I'm going to step in right now, and I'm going to mention that our guests have agreed to stay on for a little longer if anybody has additional questions, and certainly you can continue to put them in the chat. But I do want to thank our 4 speakers today predominantly. I want to tell you that we are not going to have a program in September because of the high holidays. We are having a meeting, a business meeting in October for all members of the Jewish Historical Society. We invite you to join. On November 1st, and you heard, I think it was Richard mentioned this, we are going to come back together for Sunday conversations. That will be at 5:30, and it is to commemorate the Charleston 350 years. They've told you a little bit about it, Charleston Jews and the city's notable history of religious tolerance, and they're going to be joined by Mr. Jonathan Green and Councilman Peter Shahid. Until then, we hope that you all stay well.
Lily, hold on. I'm supposed to make a pitch.
Yeah, and I'm going to turn it over now to you, Robert, to do that.
Well, you know, no Jewish organization can exist without fundraising. And so it is my great honor to pass on to you the following information. This organization accepts contributions, and it is a 501c3, so you can deduct it. If you would consider it, the way this organization actually stays in existence, we have something called the pillars. And the pillars are people who commit to give $1,000 a year for 5 years. And so if you would consider that, it would be wonderful. The organization does a lot of things. We have a website. You can see everything there is to see about the Jewish Historical Society. If that number is something you just simply cannot afford, send a check for anything. This organization does great work. Thank you very much.
So at this point, we're going to officially stop. There have been a couple of questions about the recording. Yes, we are recording this, and it will be available on Facebook. So you can see it, look for it sort of toward the end of the week. And we welcome you to stay and chat with our speakers if you would like to do so. Otherwise, we wish you well. Happy holidays to those of you who are Jewish coming up. And we hope to see you, if not at our business meeting on November 1st, when we talk about the 350 years of Charleston commemoration. Thank you all.
Okay.
While people are moving, are there any other questions that you would like to chat? The recording will be on our Facebook, the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina. Are there any other questions you can put through the chat, or you can kind of speak up if you'd like to. Take yourself off of mute.
Robert Rosen, are you there?
Robert, are you there?
I'm here. I'm holding
Yep.
up his phone
Go ahead.
so that Richard Gargle can be seen.
This is Mike Hogan. How are you doing?
Michael, how are you?
I had trouble getting on and I missed the first half hour. Did you talk about Rabbi Posnanski's statement that this is our Jerusalem and this is our temple? But I assume you mentioned also that his son, they had left this town by the time of the war between the states, and I believe they're in Canada. And his son read about the invasion of the South, and he came back to church and died defending the city at the Battle of Secession. Posnanski's,
You talking about Posnanski?
that was his son.
Right.
South Carolina had died in the Battle of Secession.
Right.
You know, I'll jump in here. It's good to see Professor Kogan. I hope he's well. I just want to say that in addition to what, for everyone who's still online, this man Posnanski, about whom I was just speaking, he had children. And one of these children, as Professor Kogan was just saying, enlisted for the Confederacy and was killed and lies buried in the Cumming Street Cemetery. However, lesser known, though he was more famous than any of the other Posnanskis, was a Posnansky son by the name of Isaac. And Isaac Posnansky became a very prominent violinist. And, you know, we're learning more about him. We have some of the music he wrote and so forth. You can go online. All of us who study regret the fact that we don't have a photo or a portrait of Gustavus Poznansky, the rabbi. To the best of my knowledge, nothing has surfaced. But we do have a photo of one of his sons, the violinist, because he was so famous. There may have been other children, I'm not sure.
Well, it's very interesting to me that in the rabbi's inaugural sermon of the new building of KKB, he said, "We will defend this city and this state and this temple the way our people defended Jerusalem and Palestine and the ancient temple." And his enlisting and dying on the battlefield defending his city was a remarkable fulfillment of the rabbi's commitment to this city.
Yes, he has that famous quote where he says, this land, meaning South Carolina, is our Palestine. This city, meaning Charleston, is our Jerusalem. I mean, it's a very moving statement.
He promised that our people would defend this city as they did Jerusalem and Palestine in the ancient time, and his son fulfilled that promise. And one should remember that when that group of boys and men in 1862 went out to Secessionville, which is on James Island, about 15 minutes from where I'm sitting at the Battery, they fended off an enormous Union force, which had orders from Halleck, the Secretary of War of the Union, to burn Charleston to the ground and to sow the ashes with salt. So those boys, if you love this beautiful peninsula city, as I do and as we all do, you can thank those boys at Secessionville for keeping out an invader that was bent on just burning it to the ground. If it weren't for those kids, we would not have this beautiful city today. It would look like Atlanta. And then again, it's been Sumter for 4 years, keeping the fleet out of here. So
One more minute.
The speech I give at the Confederate Defenders Monument is whether you like the Confederacy or not, it's not the issue. The boys and men who defended the city from being destroyed and kept it for the future ages, and the blessing for all Americans who now come to see it, and for all of us who are blessed to live here, that's what they did. And that's why they were defending.
Right. Am I still unmuted? Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Are you Mr. Regenstein?
Yeah, this is Lou Regenstein, and I'm here in Atlanta with my 100-year-old mom from Sumter, Helen Moses, who attended Temple Sinai and is a great-great-granddaughter of Isaac Harvey. And this is such a wonderful, exhilarating meeting. Thank you so much to everybody for putting this together. It's just, I can't tell you how much we appreciate it.
Mr. Regenstein, you tell your mother, this is important, that I just approved a very outstanding, excellent article written by a PhD student from Stanford University, brand new article that's going to be published in an American magazine on Isaac Harvey. And this is a pioneering work. He adds something new to the work I've done. He speaks about Harvey's political position as a supporter of Andrew Jackson in 1824 election. It's an election that Jackson did not win. But the whole question of why it would be that a Southern Jew would support Andrew Jackson in 1824 when there were candidates like John C. Calhoun from Charleston running is a very interesting question that no one has looked at. So I want Mrs. Moses to realize that she's related to a distinguished American who they're still writing about. And so I see as Anita Rosenberg there too. You know, these folks who go back to that time. I call them, they're our American aristocrats, our American Jewish aristocrats.
Ms. Regency, you also, this is Rachel Barnett. Your family also had something to do with some of the stained glass windows. Is that correct?
Hi, this is her son, and yes, Octavia Harvey Moses did donate, I think, 1 or 2 of the stained glass windows, and they're so beautiful. And I wanted to mention to Rabbi Zola that my cousin Robin Moses has a son who's a glass blower in New Orleans. His name is Andrew Jackson Pollock. So we appreciate very much the family heritage and the connection and all the great work of Rabbi Zola and everybody here today in keeping alive this wonderful heritage of our Southern Jewish roots, and including our participation in fighting for and defending our homeland, the Confederacy, which is a little bit out of style these days, but I appreciate the previous remarks about how the Confederate soldiers saved Charleston from being burned and did a great service to everybody in America. So thank all of you very much.
Thank you, Lou.
If I can chime in just for a second, doing a little research, I was in touch with Robert Moses, who is also, I gather, about 100 years old, another member of the family in Sumter. And then I gather that Harry Weinberg, who took the wonderful photographs of the stained glass, of which we have access to a whole portfolio of all the windows, is also, I believe, a descendant of the family. So the Sumter history as well is very well great stewards of the Sumter history in every way.
I have a question about the stained glass. It's my understanding that this great
Thank you so very much. It was really an inspiring program and I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
may I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The stained glass in our temple. So we neoclassical buildings never had stained glass. Stained glass is alien to them. And we love the windows, but it certainly is not in the Greek revival tradition at all. So my understanding is that the windows were clear until the earthquake, and then the windows were shattered, and these stained glass windows were put in after the earthquake. And if you go, I have preached at Bethel Church, Bethel Methodist, on Calhoun Street and Pitt, and you will find they're virtually the same windows. So I think the same fellow must have come to Charleston and done the windows of several churches, including KKBE. I've seen his work elsewhere in town. It's unmistakable. It's the no images, but just geometric.
Well, if I can respond to that. You're right, the windows at KKBE were replaced in the 1880s after the earthquake. We don't know exactly what was there before, but probably clear is likely. Sometimes Greek revival buildings did have some kind of pattern, but very light kind of a decoration. The classical revival that begins in the 1890s, of course, which we see a lot of throughout the country and especially in the South, those buildings did have stained glass, but that's really another generation and a different history. We do know that there's stained glass in some classical revival buildings already from the 1840s. Baltimore's Lloyd Street Synagogue had a little bit, and several other buildings from the 1840s through the Moorish style in the 1870s had bits of stained glass, but nothing like the extensive program that we find at KKBE. So I think it's one of the earliest. We do get these 3 windows at Mikveh Israel in the 1870s that the rabbi there designs, the ones over the Aron HaKodesh, but most of the other Mikveh Israel stained glass in Savannah is from 1899 and later. They're memorial windows. One of the things that's distinctive about the KKBE windows is each window has a pair of Jewish symbols. But most of those, if not all of those symbols, I haven't checked every one of them, were readily available and very familiar from Protestant biblical illustrations, primarily German, but by the 1880s, they were also widely available elsewhere. And so stained glass studios readily had access to those. So it's possible a rabbi worked with the stained glass studio to pick the symbols out of their pattern books essentially that could be used in both a Christian Old Testament context and in a Jewish Hebrew Bible context. But if you look at them, they are very Christian versions of biblical episodes, the cherubim, the altar, the Noah's Ark, and things like that. We don't know enough about the whole history of American synagogue stained glass. So an organization which I'm the head of, the International Survey of Jewish Monuments, we're trying to collect a lot of that data now. We're photographing stained glass windows. We're trying to make the history a little bit more understandable, but we don't have too many accounts. We do have an account of the Charleston windows from the newspaper in Charleston from 1886. That's a rare instance. And then we do have from Savannah in a newspaper article, but we have very little from Jewish sources. So the Jewish papers hardly ever comment on the stained glass windows, but the non-Jewish public newspapers often do because they're familiar with stained glass from Christian context. So I think having the artist, the same artist, if we look at those other churches, that would be very helpful to do that comparison.
I'd like to point out that the only stained glass windows in Charleston which contain Hebrew are in the Unitarian Church, and Shema Israel is written out in Hebrew. And then over the altar, you have the ark, the portable ark, and Aaron and Moses, and they're the most Jewish windows in town. I'd like to ask you if you could say something about the story of the Sumter Temple's unique stained glass windows.
Well, those windows, which were probably done about 1912 or shortly afterwards, so they would have been put in, after the building was erected. They seem to have all been done of a piece, but sometimes windows are installed sequentially as money is raised. But they all seem to be planned of a piece, and we're not 100% sure who made them, but in discussions with people in Sumter, we see that there's an inscription in the roundel on the facade of an Atlanta glass company, but I haven't been able to find out too much about that company, but it's quite likely that they're responsible, but we don't know who the artist would be, whether it would be an artist affiliated with the stained glass studio or whether somebody from the outside, which sometimes did happen. They're quite extraordinary, both the graphic quality, the drawing of them, the prophet figures and others, and the color is just spectacular. So I think they're some of the very finest American stained glass from the early 20th century, certainly along with the ones in maybe Beaumont, Texas, and a few other sets. They rank as the very best surviving series of synagogue stained glass windows that I know of, certainly from before before World War II. After World War II, we get into a totally different type of stained glass. We get a lot of Jewish artists and working with established studios, and they're doing unique themes, but it's really a different story altogether.
Thank you.
Sumter windows are spectacular. They are spectacular.
I'd like to mention that there have been a number of questions about if a family has photos or if they have some artifacts, can they give them to the Jewish Historical Society? Absolutely. Contact our executive director, Rachel Barnett, and depending on the size, we'll be able to tell you where to take them and where to send them. But we are absolutely interested in collecting as much of the history in your family, in your community, and certainly in the state to be able to keep tabs on it and to do what we're doing here today. I think Judge Gergel and Attorney Rosen, I think we're going to say good night to everybody. Thank you so much to Dr. Gruber, Dr. Zola, and all of the rest of you who've decided, I think all 67 of you who are still on for a lovely evening. And again, we apologize for some of their technical difficulties early on, but we're all learning in this crazy time of COVID.
Good night and
Bye-bye.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Night, thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, stay well.
Bye-bye.